Hello there. Thanks for stopping by the Down the Cave Hole podcast.
Donut hole. Don't confuse people.
Sorry. I think we're just fresh off of our very amazing adventure in the wilds of the southern France.
Oh, it's been fun. Wasn't that fun?
It was, yeah. It was really fun, actually.
Very tiring, though. It took me the next day to kind of get myself reorganized.
Mostly bushwhacking. That's part of the reason, I think.
Yeah, it really was. My wrists and stuff are kind of scratched up, and but it was worth it. I think it was worth it, and I'm really proud of us. I mean, it has been a long time since we've been there, and I thought maybe we had kind of a good sense for how to get back there, but I think we did pretty well, and I'm happy about that.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about the chapel, not the cave. The cave was a different thing. Always had the idea that it was further away, but actually it was kind of hidden and behind the chapel part.
Well, it's not under
far, toward the little creek down in the woods there. And they seem so primeval. I mean, that forest seems definitely like it's,
It absolutely
no
is.
human has tread there for who God knows how long.
I was walking around down there by the creek, and I saw some of those horsetail plants, and I called it echinops, but it isn't that. Echinops has like a little blue ball. It's a word that references horses, because they also call it horsetail or bottle brush, and it kind of looks like that. And it is a plant that has been on the earth in various forms since the Jurassic. Can you imagine that? And it just lended, for me anyway, this sense that area is very, very old. And I did more research. I'm still trying to find out why it is said that St. Fulcran was born there. Now, he was born in the 900s. He died in 1000 something, in the early part of 1000s. And his family, there's a record that exists from the late 1700s that said that his family was from Mérifons, which is not very far from where the chapel of the cave is. And when we say cave, now that little chapel underneath that is referred to as the cave doesn't look very cave-like, because there is an altar in there and it looks like the stone has been kind of laid up. But what it seems to me on reflection and spending some time looking at the photographs, which I think you get, in a way, better information about looking at the photographs than you do when you're on site, because there's a lot of distractions when you're on site.
Because you're in a hurry to get out of there. I think that's the main reason.
Well, yeah, if you're getting bit up and you're getting prickerized and there's beautiful birds and
bats flying everywhere.
Bats flying and the sound of the creek. I mean, there's a lot of distractions when you're there, and you're trying not to drop anything, because when it's in the overgrown state that we found it in, it would be very easy to lose something. Now, one of our friends had listened to the podcast and asked me about my reference to dropping the cat. Now, I assure you, we did not bring our kitty to that shoot.
Well, sometimes it's like a pigeon or something, you can get an early warning of something nefarious.
No, that's not what happened. A cat is a microphone cover. It looks like a powder puff, kind of a fuzzy little pom-pom, and it just keeps the sound quality better and makes sure that you're not popping your peas or other things like that. And so we usually carry one, especially on an outdoor shoot like that, because there's so many noises, and it just kind of levels it out a little bit so that speech can be heard better.
For the wind, mainly. It's wind breaks the wind up so it doesn't max out the microphone.
So that clears up some questions that we've heard about.
So all of that, and that's the only question we got?
No, that was one of the kids. And I thought, I don't want anybody to think that you and I are backpacking with a cat in the pack. And especially because anybody that knows us knows that I'm pretty sweet on Kelly. But as sweet as I am on Kelly, I certainly would not bring her to the south of France. Kelly is a semi-wild creature, and she likes to be where she likes to be, and this ain't it.
Travel with no animals.
Yeah, well, if you can.
Yeah.
That being said, okay, so that was one of the questions. Another one of the questions was about that alarm that was going off on your meter. Can you explain the meter and what it means and all of that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the alarm is something you can set. So, that was set at a point where you might expect that it's more of a result than you had in mind for the situation you're in.
In terms of electromagnetic pulses?
Yeah, a level of EMF or electromagnetic force. Or more accurately, in science, it's called flux, a flux density of magnetic or electric energy. And the readings that we were seeing were, what you normally see baseline is usually around 35 to 40-ish. And what that represents, and that's micro Teslas, by the way, and that does not mean tiny little electric cars.
Nuts.
That's what you were going to say. I headed you off.
You know me well.
Anyway, so that's a unit of measure for electromagnetic force. And that baseline represents, like I say, like 35 to 40 microteslas-ish. Is the Earth's magnetic field. That's what you're seeing. And so that's why it's pretty consistent no matter where you go on the globe. And it can peak higher if you happen to be just sort of really lucky and have yourself completely aligned to one of the Earth's magnetic lines.
The ley lines?
No, they're not ley lines. That's a different thing.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. That's the Earth's magnetic field kind of surrounds the globe like a cage a little bit. But anyway, it sort of evens out to about that 35 to 40 microteslas. So when you see that, that's your baseline. You're supposed to calibrate for wherever you want to start measuring, though, usually by putting your device in all different directions and planes and so forth to let it calibrate to what it's detecting. And then usually that'll level out to about, 35, 40 microteslas, which is, what we saw there for a baseline. So anytime that you see anything that's above that, then usually 10, there's a variation here and there. And of course, if you're closer to civilization and you have more electric lines, not far from you, or you're, in a house or in a little town or something, you're going to get some interference from that. So your baseline may be higher there. Usually something like, 10 more, maybe, high 40s or something like that.
What about the times that we saw that pegging out around 70?
Yeah, well, I'll get to that.
Okay.
Then in these particular situations, the reason some people may not understand that the reason that we do this, it's just sort of a little bit along the lines of a kind of a ghost hunting thing. And we've talked about ghosts a few times in our podcast and my theory for what they may be. And that would be the concept, in my mind at least, is that you're looking for these magnetic anomalies that are higher than baseline by at least 10. And the more they go above the baseline, then the more significant they may be. Now, you could have natural things like magnetic rocks, for instance, some lodestones or something like that has at least some residual natural magnetism to it. But that's easy enough to detect, because that will peg pretty high when you're close to it. What we're looking for really is something that's more subtle. Anything that's 10 over and, becomes a higher baseline in a certain area, it could be significant. Or if you're getting up in that 50, 60, 70 range, then unless you happen, like I say, to be lined up perfectly with a magnetic force around the Earth, then that tells you that there's some sort of extra energy there that really doesn't have an explanation. And so with the theory that I had put out there some podcasts ago, a long time ago, actually, it seems like, My idea with all that is that because everything is energy, like I keep saying, including you and everything that you can see and feel and measure, that if there were some high emotional situation that had happened in a particular place, then that will increase your energy level at that point. And that could be both good emotion or bad. Then it might tend to alter the physical environment around you, like even rocks and things are going to be imprinted a little bit with this higher emotion that comes from a human being.
Is that kind of like the idea of energy healing? A little off topic, but I'll ask it now.
Yeah, it all fits to that same sort of theory. Definitely.
Is it true that an energy healer, a qualified energy healer, can imprint like something as simple as a piece of cotton and charge it in a way that is healing?
I've heard that, yeah, some sort of object, some natural construction, but it doesn't have to be, because like literally everything, is made up of the same stuff. As far as the electromagnetic part of it, the matrix, as you will. But anyway, so back more on the subject, we will actually talk some more about the energy healing stuff, which I struggled with for a long time, but I'm beginning to open my mind more to that. Anyway, so the idea being that if there was some high emotional, in this case with the St. Fulcran's cave, it would be, if you're in there giving birth or something, there's going to be a lot of high emotional energy and energy in general in there that might have altered the surroundings enough that you can get a subtle increase in your reading, and you can actually sometimes even just map out an area, where it might have affected, depending on what happened in that location.
Well, you have to imagine if you're giving birth in a cave, you're there for a reason that is kind of charged.
Well, that's another thing, and a little bit off the topic of the measurements and stuff, but that occurred to me when you said you looked up and found out that their family was from not far away.
That is only one. Let me say, I want to qualify what I said. The report, this thing that popped up, it was a reference. I didn't see the original document. A reference to a document from the late 1700s, like 1792 or something like that. Just an oblique reference that his family was from Marathons, which is within walking distance, reasonable walking distance, of where that cave is, and that it was a mill town. And the way Marathons is situated, it's kind of in a valley. It butts up against a good mountain. And so you could picture, okay, in terms of proximity, it makes sense. But because there's other documentation that happened later, that was put together later after Fulcran joined the clergy. Apparently his mom from Marathons encouraged him to go with the clergy, and he did, even as a child. And he always had work to do, helping with food kitchens and cleaning and taking care of animals, things like that at the Abbey. And then later on, he became ordained himself and rose to the rank of bishop of Lodov, which he did not want, apparently. He did not want that rank.
Okay, my question, though, is way back at his birth, right? That's what we're talking about. And so my question is this. If the family lived nearby, why would his mother go up into a cave and hide? There had to be some reason for her to be wanting to hide this.
This is the part I don't understand. And they referenced his last will and testament, where he left money to, I think, 2 brothers and a cousin and other family in Montpellier. And there were 2 references to what Fulcran's last name was. And I don't remember either one. Well, I remember one more than the other. One looked like Rockefeuille, Rochefeuille, Uille.
Roquefort.
Okay.
Something like rock leaf or something.
That is the later, more recent understanding of what his last name was. But we also know that sometimes the clergy completely changes their name, or they adopt a first name that isn't their actual first name, that is a Christian reference to a previous saint or a healer or somebody else. Yeah. So that could have happened. But the documentation is all over the place. But you have to imagine that if he was born in that cave, and we have to imagine that it was not fixed up like it is now, even though it's not, in pristine repair by any measure now. But if that was a cave that was there that she knew about, there had to be trouble at home to choose to have a baby in that place near a damp creek than to just stay home and have your baby. So was
he illegitimate?
Well, see, now that's what I'm wondering.
And she's saying, this kid just showed up and I found him in the woods.
I know, I don't know that she would do that, but it might be that gave her a chance to deliver the baby and then maybe hand him over to the church. That may be, because it said that from an early time that she, sign him over to the care of the church, which sometimes for prominent families, sometimes that would be what would happen if there was a child.
Really his mother. Maybe this was a different woman entirely, and she did leave the baby in the cave.
No, I don't. I didn't get anything like that. But I'm just thinking that illegitimate births like that, sometimes if it wasn't condoned by the family, that's a reasonable thing to think.
Yeah. And of course, we're talking about the late 900s here, so who knows what kind of political or religious strife was going on, and who was on the ins or the outs with all of that.
He was born in the front half of the 900s. Now, later on, the miracles that supposedly he performed himself, and then later the miracle of his hand popping out of the cook pot, that there was an old lady. His bones, his relics were kept in the cathedral, which was dedicated to him. It had been built earlier. It's a Gothic-style cathedral, and I have pictures that we'll put up. So hopefully in the next day or two, you get to see those pictures of the current cathedral of St. Fulgrin in the city of Lodève in the south of France.
Anyway, my point for all that is, talking about the readings, is that not only would there be a lot of emotion and high energy in giving birth, but on top of that, there's another story, I'm sure, that would have increased that even more. So what we did find was that there was some significantly high readings, some of the highest that we've seen above ambient, percentage-wise, in certain areas. And one of the ones that kicked the highest, I think, if you listen to the podcast, was actually near one of the metal bars. It was the one on the extreme left, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that, the deduction of that situation was that particular bar must have been resonant to the surrounding electromagnetic force, and it acted like an antenna.
That would not have been present during the time of his birth. It certainly does not date from the 900s.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying that was obviously more recent to keep people from hanging out in there. But the thing of it is, what it was doing, in my opinion, was that it was acting like an antenna, which actually amplified the other electromagnetic force sources much higher than would be normally picked up by the antenna and the devices that we're using to measure. So, that's my conclusion there. And the other bars, which some of them were physically a little bit longer and all that, actually had lower readings. So that tells me that one that had such a high reading was resonant with the surrounding extra electromagnetic force that we can't explain. And this, with this theory, it's a possibility that it's actually repeating the electromagnetic variations that are in that area and then passing it on to the meter.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So I would think that then that does point to the fact that that maybe is the correct cave. That is where whatever happened there, and that that was something highly emotionally charged. So that's kind of certainly a good theory.
It is. Also, that chapel is much more known, and the legend of him having been born in that cave space underneath where there's actually two chapels. It's two sides of the same structure above there. That's more known locally. I mean, like I say, I've done a fair bit of digging around, and I really haven't turned anything up. And there's several little books of local history regarding Lodève, which is the diocese that would include this Maryfonds. And that does not really mention anything about him having been born, in more rural agrarian household. It suggests the literature that was put together much later after his death, a couple hundred years, well, more than that, about 700 years after his death, says that he came from a well-off family. And so, which is it? Will we ever know? Probably not. But it's worth keeping your eye out for documents that would reference other materials that maybe have fallen out of vogue. But it's an interesting place to go. I am certain, because there's a couple of roads in the area that are well traveled, and there's an increasing number of businesses that are popping up in the region. This area is much more touristed now than it used to be. I'm certain that we are not miles and miles and miles by any measure away from electric lines, but I don't see that would have a big issue for what we were.
Well, the nearest one, just so you know, when we did encounter an electric line, and it was a fairly high voltage one for long distance transmission up the side of the mountain. It looked like it was going to go, actually. So I did some baseline readings there, and there were no difference there. A little bit. It was like 47 or something like that microteslas, which is pretty much within the range of normal baseline. So it wasn't putting out a big effect right there underneath the tower, then it certainly wasn't where we were.
I see. For me, the experience was a little bit bittersweet, because I remember the first time or two, I mean, it's a long, long time now since we were there, and it looked like it was in regular use. And it would be easy to envision people coming with maybe some folding chairs or something.
Yeah, the little
sitting
chapel,
there for religious service.
The open air one, and the one that has the door. Remember, you encountered and you were disappointed, thinking we were locked out there. But we've been to those a few times. But the area is, like I said, it's so sort of primeval around there.
Oh, very.
And that cave is really kind of not that far away, but it's just very well hidden. If you didn't know that something like that was around there, you probably would never stumble on it.
And you would probably be discouraged from scrabbling down to the creek because of all the prickly things that grow there. And you really do have to kind of wade through it step by step. And so
you were thinking about the bittersweet thing, and I thought maybe you'd talk about how you felt. I mean, I think when we were actually there, I said, why don't you take a minute and vibe stuff out? But it is hard when you're getting pricked by stuff and bats are flying around.
And you're getting bitten by mosquitoes.
Did you have any, at least semi-quiet moment where you could get a vibe from the whole area?
And for me, like I say, the best description is bittersweet all the way around. It was sad to see it having fallen into such disrepair, especially that front chapel, because I have the sense that would be used more publicly, would have been used. And the space isn't huge,
It's quite small, yeah.
It's quite small. And like I say, the structure itself is made out of rubble, but when we first went there, it looked like it was in regular use and that people were taking advantage of having that nice little chapel there. The side chapel, the one with the door, the one where the bats enjoy staying, mostly, that looks more for quiet reflection or, prayer or meditation, that's a much more enclosed space. And apart from the bats, I could see myself enjoying spending some time there, in reflection. And I've always felt that in the cross painted on the wall behind that. And I need to see if I can pull up some of the pictures that I took of that altar in the side chapel and see if I can evaluate what the crest is. It looks like a heart shape in the photographs at first glance. That's all it looks like, is a heart shape. But inside that shape, it's a lighter bluish, almost a turquoise color. In that shape, it looks to me like a bishop's mitre and then other shapes, but in the moment, mostly because I was keeping one of my eyes out for bats. I didn't want to spend too much time poring over that. So I did take a picture, and I'm hoping that I can sit down with that someday soon and see if I can make out what it looked like two other shapes, which would be, kind of consistent with like a heraldic coat of arms thing.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, it really was. And so I would like to look at that more closely because here's a theory of mine. If he really is from the area around Maryfonds, then certainly there would be people there who would consider themselves family. And if it was a well-to-do family, they definitely would have a crest. And they would see to it, given his fame and the fact that he became an honest-to-goodness saint, they would want ties to him regardless of the circumstances of his birth. And remember, these days, we take births out of wedlock for granted. It's okay. Everybody deals with it. Back in those days, for important families, having a child born to one of the members of your family without wedlock, that would be a real stain on the family's reputation. And it was considered in those days different for the male members of the household to father children with not noble women, but to have a girl, a woman of the household, of a noble household, have a child by someone other than a worthy partner, meaning equally or more well-to-do, then I could think, maybe there was enough backlash, and I don't know. I mean, you just, in a case like this where there's really no documentation, you're left to look at the mores of the times and figure what would the reason be that a woman would choose or find herself in a cave to have her baby, because by the 900s, we're not talking about cave dwellers here anymore. We're talking about people, and certainly in this area, it was fairly well populated. I mean, it's rural, but there would be households and enclosures and
Is it feasible,
animals.
and you having personal experience with such things, to be able to hide a pregnancy right up until the time of the term?
Yeah, it depends on the style of clothing that you wear, I think with situations like that, you just, like I say, you examine, okay, what were the mores of the times, and consider that there may be possibilities along those lines. Other than that, the thing is just keep your eye out, and if you see any information pop up while you're reading something else, then you think, oh, okay, I remember that. And, kind of keep track of that sort of data that you're getting. I like, sometimes here you can see little publications that are put out or have been put out over the years. Everything from little recipe books. I have one that I got here many years ago that is a little collection of proverbs from the Languedoc region where we are. And they're very interesting. And they reveal a lot about the mindset of the people, what's important, and the kind of wisdom that they wish to convey in those little sound bites, for all intents and purposes, to their children. And those get passed down because they become part of the popular lexicon, essentially, don't let your eyes be bigger than your stomach, or an empty chair is always blamed, which is kind of a cool one. Anyway, I'm not going to get off on that now. But meaning if you don't show up for the meeting and there's some sort of problem, they're probably going to try to shift,
Gotcha.
responsibility to the person that isn't there to defend themselves. So an empty chair always is blamed. Stuff like that. Anyway, the Cathedral of Bishop St. Lodave is a beautiful edifice. We were both impressed because it's easy to get in and out of. A lot of cathedrals have multiple staircases that you have to traverse to get in and out. And when you get inside, the contrast between the outdoor light and the darkness and the quiet inside the church is often a little bit difficult to maneuver around in when you first come in. But that one's pretty good. It is dark inside. They have beautiful stained glass windows in there and many paintings. On one side of the cathedral, there's a little chapel dedicated to Mary, and that's a very beautiful one with a wonderful stained glass window behind. And there are 3 or 4 paintings on the side walls of that little side chapel, and they're right off the main nave, all of these little chapels. There's and that one, about those paintings, somebody produced a poster that had images of what those paintings are. A lot of them, the colors now are very muted from years and years of dust and dirt, kind of diminishing the colors. So it's kind of hard to make out exactly all the nuance of the paintings, but somebody did a nice little poster, and I took a picture of that off to the side so I could see, and those were landmarks in the life of the Virgin Mary, according to Catholic tradition. There's another chapel dedicated to Saint Roch, who, if you remember, he had, I believe, leprosy or something, and I think what it was is he was a great one for visiting lepers and people that were very, very ill. And at one point, I think he caught it himself, and I believe he was cured by a dog, who he was off on the mountainside isolating himself, and for all intents and purposes dying. And a dog came out of nowhere, and the dog was licking these wounds, cleaning these wounds for this poor man that couldn't even sit up. And the dog was bringing him food from his master's table. And it turns out the dog led the noble, the owner of the household nearby, to where St. Roch was lying, and the owner of the estate carried him back, and they nursed him back to health, and he lived. And then later, he didn't live very long afterwards, but it was a different cause of death. I think he was thrown in prison or something like that, and succumbed in the dungeons, but not by the owner of the building. So anyway, there are a number of chapels there. I think there is a small one to St. Fulcran himself, and 3 or 4 other ones. It was hard to see. Some of the signage was difficult to read, just in terms of the light, and also I needed a little bit brighter because I don't have a great command of French, and so it takes me a little bit of a time to do it. And even just getting pictures of it wasn't all that great, just in terms of being able to get good, clear pictures that I could take home and work on later. But it's a beautiful, beautiful place. It's very convenient to the tourist center in the city of Lodève, which is a very scruffy, kind of a blue-collar, ancient town. And I like the vibe over there. I really do. And I like the vibe in the cathedral. There's a certain amount of practical sensibility in the whole place. It's less grandiose than some places, So
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the area in general. So hopefully we can get out there and track down some of these other things.
I would like to go to the ruin up on the back mountain from where we are now.
Which one?
Up above Octon.
There's a lot of them.
I know. I want to go to the one with the
going back to Neolithic times, right up through the medieval.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind doing that. I don't know.
There's a castle ruin up there.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to have much history that you can find, frankly. So that's another kind of mystery. We'll go up there sometime and see what we can vibe out, so to speak. But there's also some ruins further up that are more recent, I think. It looked like maybe it was an old farmhouse or somebody that tended sheep up on the high levels, maybe, something like that. And then if you get way up on the top of the ridge, you have Neolithic artifacts like standing stones and dolmen and the like.
I have never been there. You and our eldest son went up there, but I stayed back with the baby because there was no point, why even bother? So you and our eldest son went up there. So sometime I want to go up there too, but I'm determined to find out exactly how far are we talking about here, because
I don't know. We'll try
the
to
back of my leg was so sore after our trek the other day, and it isn't all that far. I'm embarrassed to say.
We got to get you so you can just sit there and kind of meditate a bit and pick up your own vibe. But we'll have the instruments with us too. And let me just say, now that I've touched back on the instruments, is that I don't think that this is all speculative, of course, but it is interesting. And, there is some science behind it if you drill down far enough. But I do think, along with my ideas on things, is that I don't think that the primary amount of energy is within the range of what we know how to measure. We know how to observe. I think that the electromagnetic force and all that stuff that we can measure is only a small fraction of what's out there. And in a way, I guess maybe I would describe it like what we can measure are like the ripples from an unseen wave, so to speak. Hey, that was pretty poetic.
Yeah, I like that.
Ripples from an unseen wave.
Yeah.
And because we only really know and can measure about 5% of what's out there, then the same way with what we're trying to do here. The little measurements we have are a clue, but you're not going to get the full picture unless you figure out how to measure all the other stuff out there.
Yeah.
So we're measuring the ripples, and maybe the ripples of other ripples. Who knows how far down?
Well, that's exactly right. Also, I will say, in places like that, one of the things that I'm looking for is escapee plants. Now, there's a lot of plants that will grow that have escaped from cultivated gardens. They're not really a wildflower kind of thing, a native wildflower. And so when you're around an old place, an old church, an old farmstead, an old estate, sometimes you'll find plants growing that were cultivated. They were not, just wildflowers, transplanted wildflowers, like I like to experiment with. They're actually cultivated garden plants. Sometimes you'll come upon an old orchard where there's fruit trees and they're in proximity, so at one point or another those were part of a household's garden structure.
Castle ruins we spoke of, how you can get bay leaves from there.
I love doing that, and that's a motivator for me to get back up there. But those things tell you something. So sometimes if you're going along and you see runs of, here in Europe, and in the States to some extent, but you see runs of stone walls, those are pens for sheep primarily, or other animals, or they are the walls that delineate terraces, that give terraces their form for olive trees, olive cultivation, or grapevines and that, because terracing is really important, especially in this area because it's extremely mountainous. And so when you see those, you know that you are near to a farmstead, a center for cultivation, for family's business. And so I kind of keep my eye out for things that are growing like that. Now, the place you're referencing, a place I'd like to go and get some video on that, the bay trees, they're huge bay laurel trees. And that tells you that this definitely was an upper class really, farmstead, homestead, estate. And so those are all little clues that you can find along your way if you're paying attention to the flora, especially, and of course animals too, but less so. They're less apt to let you see them. But that is something I definitely enjoy, both appreciating the wildflowers that grow, the wild herbs that grow here, adds an awful lot to my appreciation of the whole place. And so that's one of the reasons why I try to include them in a description of places that we're going or what we're seeing, or even just around where we are generally. There are just so many different varieties of plants that, to me, it is infinitely fascinating. And all of those plants pretty much have a usage. Most of them to promote health and well-being, but there are some that were used in other ways, as fungicides, as strewing herbs to kind of ward off fleas and other vermin in a household. And so all of those are ancient traditions. Those are echoes of the region that you're exploring. And so it should be part of your consciousness as you experience a place. And I find that's one of the best understandings, because you think this is a direct chain that has come down to you. And I absolutely love that. Plus, it's delightful to your eye. It's like a painting. I will say, however, that I do think I am a little more bothered by allergies here than I am when I'm back home. But it isn't surprising because of all of the different botanicals and grasses and trees that are everywhere here. So, anyway.
Yummy.
Yeah, yummy, especially the culinary ones. Wow.
Yeah.
My cooking is infinitely better here than it is back home.
Oh, you're amazing, but you're right. Your ingredients do make a lot of difference, don't they?
Certainly do, and I try to make use of it as much as I possibly can. And I told in a previous podcast about we had a grocery delivery. We only get them a couple times a month, and that's all the heavy stuff that we would have to carry on our backs because it's hard getting a taxi or an Uber here because we're kind of out in the sticks. But I had the bad cold, and the delivery driver told me, he says, well, use some of that. And he points down, and it's a wild thyme plant. He says, gather some of that, take it in. He said, make a strong tea out of that, put a nice, generous bit of honey in there. He said, that'll make you feel better. He wasn't kidding. It worked great. And so now I want to make sure I am never without thyme tea. So,
never without time.
Yeah, that's even more important than being without thyme tea.
And at the end of the podcast, you can say, we're without time.
And we are, Dave. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Bye. Next time.
Talk to you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.